Why don't you go ahead, Mr. Willett?
Thank you.
Can you hit that button, please? I'm going to ask all the witnesses if you can make a good effort to be succinct and concise. If you can summarize your testimony, you will be most welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Rohrbacher, for convening this hearing. It's been a privilege of mine as a civilian lawyer to meet so many military lawyers who, turns out, are on our side of this debate. You'd be surprised, as I was when I got involved. My friend has spoken of military commissions. As far as I understand, only 15 human beings have ever been referred for military commission. So why don't we focus on the 255 who will never be charged with any crime, who for the last 7 years and 4 months at all times could have been court-martialed under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, but were not, and who never will be. And in particular, I want to talk about my client so that you can understand what all of this policy turns into in human terms. Now, this subcommittee has already heard about the Uyghur dissidents from communist China who were caught up in the so-called war on terror. This spring, you read reports from China's news agency about how the Dalai Lama was a terrorist. That's the same word that the communists have used for the Uyghurs ever since 9/11. One of my clients, Huzaifa Parhat, is a Uyghur. He's never been accused by the military of being a captured al-Qaeda fighter or any other kind of fighter. He never will be. In fact, he's been cleared for release for years. 2 weeks ago, he began his 7th year at Guantanamo Bay. He believes in things like freedom of worship. He denounces state-enforced abortion. He doesn't care much for communism. In China, beliefs like Huzaifa's are called intellectual terrorism. Uyghurs are regularly tortured and jailed for them. One of them is with us this afternoon, Rebia Kadir, the lady seated to your right in the white suit, after developing a business in China, spent 6 years in a prison there for the crime of intellectual terrorism. She sent a newspaper to her husband living abroad. I can remember when we Americans admired people who stood up for these kinds of beliefs. Now, Huzaifa is offered, what do they call it? A single occupancy cell in Camp 6. Interrogators said in 2003 that his capture was a mistake. The Department of State has been trying to find a place to send him ever since, but the Allies have all read the same shrill rhetoric about Guantanamo that you have, and they've all noticed that America isn't taking any of these people. So nobody wants Huzaifa. Now, he lives in a place called Camp 6. My information dates from March, at which point all of the Uyghurs but one were kept there. The men call it the dungeon above the ground. Each lives alone in an isolation cell. There's no natural light or air. There's no way to tell whether it's day or night. Outside your cell, there's a kind of noisy bedlam of banging doors and the murmurs of men shouting at door cracks. Inside, there's nothing. Mr. Chairman, can you remember the last time you were alone? I mean, really alone. No one to talk to, nothing to read, no phone, no computer, no iPod, television, no radio, no activity, no companion. The psychiatrists say that if you try this, you shouldn't try it for longer than a day. That's been most of Huzaifa's life since December 2006. For 2 hours in 24, the MPs shackle and lead him to what they call, without a trace of irony, the wreck area. This is a 2-story chimney, about 4 meters square. It's your only chance to talk to another human being or see the sun. But the wreck time might be at night. It might be after midnight. Weeks go by during which you never see the sun at all. Mr. Chairman, you try talking to a man whose last hope in life is to see the sun. You'll never forget the experience. And did I mention this man was cleared for release years ago? In the cell, he can crouch at his door. He can yell through the crack at the bottom. The guy in the next cell might actually hear him if he's not curled and facing the wall in the fetal position. Another Uyghur told us of the voices in his head. The voices were getting the better of him, he said. His foot was tapping on the floor as he said this to me. I don't know what's happened to him. He doesn't come out of the cell to see us anymore. Huzaifa believes he will die in Guantanamo. He told us to tell his wife to consider that he has died and remarry. Mr. Chairman, the Uyghurs are not the enemy. Under Article 1 of our Constitution, you in Congress, and you in Congress alone, say who the enemy is. The President is our Chief General and Admiral, but you are the deciders. It is your job to say who the enemy is, and it is his job to carry out the mission. And you never declared war on Uyghurs, or for that matter, on radical Islam. There is no legal war on terror. But suppose for a moment that the Uyghurs were the enemy. Would you leave them in isolation in Camp 6? Not if you've read the service field manuals, you wouldn't. My friend mentioned General Washington. Well, that's not how General Washington treated the most feared enemy combatants of the day when he captured them at Christmas 1776 at Trenton. The Hessians. We read about them in history books. He directed that they be treated with honor. And yet this afternoon at Camp 6 in Guantanamo, we are using the same isolation techniques that the North Koreans used on our downed airmen in 1952. The cells are shinier, the paint is fresher, but the cruel and blithe destruction of the human soul is the same. In 1952, our ambassador went to the floor of the United Nations to denounce this as a step back to the jungle. How quaint of him. Now, perhaps the camp commandant would say that Huzaifa has misbehaved in some way. They haven't told me. In the grinding, endless heat of Guantanamo, tensions simmer. MPs who want any post but that one. Guards who were 12 years old when my client was brought there. Mishandle a Quran or gawk at a prisoner on a toilet, or so someone thinks. After 6 years, it hardly matters anymore. The tensions boil over. Have the Uyghurs boiled over 5 years after being told that they would be released? Would I boil over? Would you? In the service field manuals, you'll find the remedy for boiling over, and the maximum isolation period permitted is 2 weeks. I'd like to tell you very briefly about one other detainee during wartime, held at Fort McKay, near where I go to work every morning in Boston. He had served a fascist tyrant who was in league with the most dangerous madman in the history of Europe. He had shot to kill Americans on the battlefield during a desperate war in which we thought our civilization, as we know it, might end forever. And still, the commandant did not throw the Italian prisoner of war into a Camp 6. He lived communally. And when hostilities with Italy ended in 1944, we couldn't send him back to the Italian peninsula. It was in flames. We did the next best thing in Boston. Leave was given to visit the North End. The prisoner went to Mass. He played bocce on the Esplanade. He had a job and earned pay. Young girls passed notes through the fence at Carson's Beach. There were no proposals of torture and not a few of marriage. Do the Uyghurs in 2008 frighten us more than the Axis forces frightened Navy Captain Errol Willett in 1944? Or are we just a smaller people than our grandparents were? I won't dwell on the Detainee Treatment Act that you enacted 3 years ago. I've litigated the lead case. It's a train wreck. Hundreds of cases are nowhere. You establish a new court, new rules. We'll spend 3 more years figuring it out. And the Uyghurs, those who will still see me at all, nod politely when I tell them about our courts. But they long ago concluded that our courts are just a debating society, if they exist at all. Mr. Chairman, what will you do about Guantanamo? A sign there says, honor bound to defend freedom, and you have 50 or 60 stateless people who are cleared for release, that is to say, cleared for freedom. Are we Americans honor bound to defend that value, or are we just talking? Will you make that happen? Even Mr. Casey has acknowledged that after 6 years, some should be paroled to the United States. Now, taking them here is going to take some gumption. The administration's propaganda is effective. Most of your constituents believe that anything associated with Guantanamo is associated with terrorism. But our flag asks a little gumption of us from time to time, and this is such a time. Because outside the world is turning, my client's wife has remarried. Inside the wire, nothing changes. Huzaifa Parhat has been a prisoner at Guantanamo from the day the Arizona was attacked at Pearl Harbor, straight through to the surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, and almost back again. He's in his cell this afternoon in Camp 6. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Willett.